Alrighty. Well, I'm going to tell you another funny story, kind of funny anyway. And this story goes back, it's cold in here yet, although the sun is shining, and that helps a bit. There's Rocky. Rocky. Right there. He's having a sleep in the sun. He is. Anyway, this story goes back to the early 1980s when I was staying with my dad and my stepmother around 1982. And there used to be a show on television up here in Canada on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC, and it was called the Royal Canadian Air Farce, as opposed to Force. It was the Air Farce. And basically, they were a comedy troupe that did skits and everything. And one of them had this recurring character he played where he'd make speeches. He was a politician, and he was the member of Parliament for Kicking Horse Pass. That was his title, I guess. And he would talk about different things anyway, and so on like that. And I remember watching this with my dad. One evening it was on, and we were sitting there watching it. And anyway, this guy, he was up there, this comedian, doing his thing, pretending to be a member of Parliament, a representative for whatever, for Kicking Horse Pass, the member for Kicking Horse Pass. And he was talking about, I guess some politician at that time had said that those who don't have jobs should put on their shoes and walk to where the jobs are. There's a typical politician, totally out of touch with the people. But this is what a politician had said. And at that time, Japan was coming up. Japan was getting to be more and more of where the manufacturing was happening. And in North America, manufacturing hadn't gone away by any stretch of the imagination, but the writing was on the wall. We all kind of knew that was coming. And but Japan was quite a manufacturing powerhouse, or at least it was growing up as one. It was coming up as one at that time. Now, when I was a little kid, I remember people used to say made in Japan, not worth a damn. But the quality of their stuff was getting better, and they were doing more manufacturing, and more jobs were going there at that time. And people who worked in factories were getting a little worried because of that. Anyway, that's the background of it. He was talking about this member of Parliament who said that anyway, who said those who don't have jobs should put on their shoes and walk to where the jobs are. So he says, so-and-so, I can't remember what politician it was now. They're all asshats anyway, as far as I'm concerned. But he said that this politician had said that. And then he said, okay, he said, how about a show of hands on that? How many of you can walk to Japan? And I remember my dad sat there, he started laughing. He just gutted himself laughing, He did burst out in laughter, when he said that. Okay, how about a show of hands on that, he says. How many of you can walk to Japan? Anyway, this kind of a funny memory I have anyway. Something from years and years ago now. But, and I do know at the time even, I knew I was 14 years old in 1982. But I was aware that, we still had a lot of manufacturing in Canada. It hadn't actually gone away yet. I was aware that it was most likely going to. It was something we all knew was coming. And of course, about 10 years later, it did come in a big way. But, yeah, anyway, just kind of a funny story, I remember. Just never forget that guy saying that, standing up there, that comedian, and saying that. Talking about this politician who said that you should put on your shoes and walk to where the jobs are. Oh, there was one other thing. It's funny. We were watching the news one time. And this is back, we had the big wooden cabinet type TV, back in those days where you had the big console type TV, with the beautiful wood cabinet and stuff. That television actually died while I was watching it late one night. The high voltage rectifier tube went out of it. And when the high voltage rectifier tube went out of a television in those days, I'll tell you, the television would make a hell of an awful sound when it did that. And the room would fill with black smoke. And it was just a stink, just a dirty, stinking thing, And I had that happen a couple of times with televisions I was watching where the high voltage, because they had vacuum tubes in them back then. And when the high voltage rectifier tube would go, it was a hell of a thing. Basically, the TV would take fire. You'd get a crap ton of black smoke, and sometimes you'd even get flames. But you always got a lot of black smoke when that happened, and I never forget the sound the television would make when that happened, too. Anyway, I just went over and pulled the plug out of the wall, is what I did when that happened with that television. But there was one time we were watching the news, and in the United States at that time, they were still doing a lot of executions by electric chair. And it was a pretty regular thing that you'd hear these accounts on the news of guys being put to death in the electric chair in the United States. Anyway, we were watching the CJOH news, which was out of Ottawa. It was Channel 13, I remember, CJOH, around here. And the newscaster at that time was a guy by the name of Max Keeping. And he's long dead now, but that was the guy who read the news, a fellow by the name of Max Keeping. Anyway, there was some really funny story. I can't remember what it was now, but it was a really funny story. And Max Keeping got into laughing. And when the story was over, that he read about the story, and then they had like a video of it or whatever. They had a field reporter do a piece on it. And then they came back to Max Keeping sitting there at the news desk, and he was just laughing his head off. But the next story up was a story about some man in the United States, some convicted murderer, being electrocuted in the electric chair. And I guess it had been a botched execution, too. It hadn't gone to plan. And it was one of those ones where, the guy takes, there was lots of smoke and flames and things. The guy's body took fire when they were electrocuting him. And so, of course, we see that come up on the screen behind Max Keeping, and he's still gutting himself. He's still laughing, but he's trying to get himself under control. And we see at the screen in the background, we see botched execution, in whatever state it was. I can't remember if it was Florida or Texas or Virginia or where it was now, but botched execution and Max Keeping sitting at the desk, just gutting himself laughing. And my dad was sitting there, and he said, "Oh boy, he better pull himself together for this next one," he said. You could imagine if you're gutting yourself laughing while you're telling a story like that about some guy bursting into flames in the electric chair. Anyway, he did manage to get himself composed enough that he could give the next story more solemnity, I guess you could say, in its delivery. But I remember my dad sitting there saying that. He said he better pull himself together for this next one. He said you could see it up on the screen behind him there, Botched execution, They probably shouldn't have had a really serious story like that right behind a really funny story. But somebody kind of got the order of things wrong, I think. in doing that. But anyway, to his credit, Max Keeping did pull himself together, and he just enough that he was able to tell the next story um, without laughing his head off throughout it. Anyway, yeah, there's Rocky again. We'll see you later.